Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Browne. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and the founder of Global Progress. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today, and welcome to the Recovery Project. The Recovery Project is a joint coalition of three organizations: Global Progress, Canada 2020, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Our goal is to start a conversation about post-pandemic recovery. If you want to learn more about us, you can find us at recoveryproject.org. Let's begin. We're very fortunate to have with us today Lodewijk Asscher, leader of the Dutch Labour Party since 2016 and former Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Thanks for being here, Lodewijk. You recently published a very interesting article, which you can find on the Recovery Project website, talking about how to rebuild after the COVID crisis. I'm going to ask you in a few moments to sort of talk us through some of those early ideas and then go into a conversation. Before I do that, though, I'd like to say to those of you who are joining us for the first time, this will be an open dialogue. We will open up to questions. The team at the Recovery Project will be tracking questions, so please do use the Q&A facility, and we'll do our best to integrate your concerns and the issues you want to address into that conversation. But if I may, Lodewijk, I'll turn to you. Thanks once again for joining us. Welcome to the Recovery Project, and we look forward to hearing your ideas on rebuilding after the COVID crisis.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you everybody for tuning in and joining in this conversation. I also appreciate the Recovery Project, and I think it's very important to bring progressive thought together around the issue of how to recover and how to rebuild. For me, I think this crisis, of course, it's very consuming. You watch the news all the time, you watch your Twitter feed, and that makes it sometimes hard to really think hard about recovery. But I think it's an obligation for us to do so, because otherwise we will be stuck in a new normal that would be very much like the old normal, but just a bit worse. And as a young boy, I was fortunate enough to be able to talk to my grandfather, who survived Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Nazi Germany, and talk to him about what were their expectations for what would happen after the war, if there was to become a time of peace. And I still remember that he told me, well, our first and foremost hope was, of course, to be safe, to be secure. We were not very optimistic about the human mankind, and they had all reason to be pessimistic about it. But he also said there was also a feeling that we should do things differently to prevent conflict, to make sure that people were able to make a decent living, make sure that we work together internationally instead of on a nation state level. And I think this pandemic is not like a war, but it's a shock. It's the biggest shock, at least in the Netherlands, since World War II, the biggest peacetime shock we ever lived through. So we should ask ourselves, what would we want to change in order to rebuild our society in a fair and just way? And just to kick off the conversation, I think there's three issues we should be able to tackle. And first of all, it's a way we, the social contract is built between the government, citizens, and corporations. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen that and there's numerous studies about it, and most of the viewers who have written those studies, so they will know much more about it than I. But we've seen that the balance has shifted from profit for workers to profit for shareholders. And I think if we do not change that now, it will hamper recovery, and it will cause further inequality. And inequality is, I think, the second aspect we need to look into. It's also contagious. You can see in the United States how the virus is hurting people in a different way. And I think if we do not realize this while recovering, inequality could also become pandemic and therefore cause social unrest and make it much harder to build our society in a good way. And the third part, I think, is if we want to look for a brighter future, we have to realize that the bill cannot be picked up by normal working people again, because actually in my country, and Matt mentioned this, I was a deputy prime minister at the time we had to recover from the financial crisis. In my country, people still feel the pain of austerity, of that financial crisis. And the idea that we could, ask them to pay for this one again is simply inconceivable. But we do have to answer the question, who is going to pay for it? So that also requires, from the political point of view, a much more ambitious, robust politics of redistribution, a much more robust politics of progressive policies when we engage this issue by safeguarding small and medium enterprises, but asking the global corporation, the big tech firms that are actually making a living in these days, we're using them right now, to help us pick up that bill. So that's just 3 points to start the discussion, but I'd be very happy to go into both policy and thought about where we should go and how we should rebuild. I think we should do it together. Part of it is international solidarity is not a problem, but is a solution. And so far it's been lacking. And also my current government, which I'm opposing, I'm leading the Labour Party as an opposition party, has not shown that much solidarity. And I think that's a mistake, not only in the short-term self-interest, but also in the longer-term interest of both my country and this continent. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Lodewijk, and thanks for sharing those 3 points. And I think as we go through the conversation, we can dig into each of them in a little more detail. But I might start actually by sort of taking us back a little bit from that. And you mentioned your experience during the global financial crisis, and I think you alluded to that when you said we can't let ordinary people pay for this crisis again. So one of the questions I'd like to ask you in a big picture frame is, what are the lessons you learned from the crisis a decade ago? How does that inform your view of how we should approach recovery now? And related to that, what do you see as the international context for that? Of course, when we had the global financial crisis, there was a great deal of collaboration amongst the G20 members of the EU and elsewhere, and that seems to be lacking. So I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on that past experience and how it can inform what we're trying to achieve today.
Well, I think in general, during the global financial crisis, the response, at least in Europe, was too soft on the financial corporations and too hard on our citizens. And you can, of course, see differences, and it helps if there's a progressive or a Labour government. But still, in general, we have to be honest about this. I think we trusted or put too much faith in a cultural change in financial institutions that just didn't occur. So as soon as they got the opportunity, bonuses went up again and irresponsible behavior came back. While at the same time being very strict on budget restrictions and austerity. And that has not only, I think, damaged people in their personal life, but it also damaged trust in government and trust in progressive politics. Of course, we've done a lot of things to pull through, and we've seen a very good recovery afterwards. But my personal experience when I was in government, we were already in a very ambitious program, and in 2013 we had to cut another 6 billion euros. There was no economic rationale for that. It was just almost a race to the bottom. So that's one lesson: is look at the long-term economic prospects and make sure that people can actually survive the mid-term effects of this crisis. So invest in their jobs and make sure that the public sector is robust during and along this crisis. Second, I think we have to adopt a different approach on how we look at public debt. My country always has a fixation on having a very low public debt, but at current interest rates, that doesn't seem so logical. And third, I think you're very right. G20 was under Gordon Brown was quick to respond in a very good way, I believe. And of course, the mistakes were made, but there was a lot of cooperation. This time around, even though the WHO gives some very clear guidelines, both on the strategy on how to tackle the pandemic itself, but also on the economic strategy, we don't see that cooperation. And it will be helpful if there's another US administration. I think we would all welcome that. But even, left aside that part, I think within Europe, cooperation has been very weak, and it's so necessary. And when it comes to the vaccine we need, when it comes to adopting the same strategy so we can open our borders, when it comes to economic recovery, no country can do it by themselves. You would just go down if you try to do it by yourself. So I think there's also an obligation or an opportunity for progressive politicians in positions in all those countries to step up their cooperation and make sure that we demand to approach this together, because otherwise we just will not be able to fix it and serve our voters.
Thank you, Lodewijk. I certainly agree with you that there's going to be need for greater international cooperation, and that's indeed one of the driving forces of global progress and of the recovery project. The first point that you made in your opening remarks was about the social contract, and we've had a question from Paul Williams that relates to that in some way, when he talks about how would you manage the payments from large corporations. What would be the process for getting them to contribute more? Now, I remember I greatly enjoyed reading your essay, and I advise all of those of you watching today, if you haven't already, to go back to that essay. But in that piece, you talk a little bit about those companies, domestic companies that have benefited from support from the government, being held to a higher standard of account going forward. You've raised the idea of a recovery tax on the social media companies. I wonder if you could just go in a little bit into how you think that might actually work in practice. What are the kind of policy mechanisms that you could use to ensure that as we move on, that sort of neoliberal underlining of the social contract is moved and we're replaced with something what I would call reciprocity and underpinning the social contract on the part of businesses?
Well, thanks, Paul, for posing this question, because I think it's a very important one, because the decisions are made right now. Most countries in Europe have made robust packages to safeguard jobs and save companies. The Netherlands is looking at a budget deficit of 92 billion euros for this fiscal year. So that's quite enormous for a small country. I think we have to be very clear that demands need to be made. Right now in the Netherlands, we are, as taxpayers, paying 90% of the salaries of people working in the private sector, 90%. So we think that we should ask in return for those companies to behave responsibly, and to behave responsibly is not paying dividends, is not awarding bonuses, is not buying your own stock. Is second, to continue hiring those people, so we will not accept them firing people we just paid their salary for. And third, to adopt an approach for the future where you show that corporate social responsibility is part of your future in the Netherlands. Those are three demands that need to be made today, because otherwise we know that just a moral appeal will not do the job. So that's, I think, the first level. In those big packages that are rolled out all across Europe, you need to put in those demands, because otherwise we'll not be in a position to realign corporate social responsibility in a new social contract. Second, I think at the European level, after this crisis, we need to agree on a minimum level of corporate tax, because we've seen the situation for over a decade now, and it's been part of the neoliberal consensus where the bigger corporations can just shop and just say to my government or to your government, well, we're going to go to the neighbor if you do not lower corporate tax. And this has led to an enormous decrease in the amount of tax paid by the bigger corporation. And the only way to stop it is not by a single country, but by adopting a minimum level. And it's a taboo, of course, because taxation is a national competence. But in this era, I think it's not only acceptable to do it, I think it's necessary if we want to make sure that the bill is not picked up by by single household, middle-class people. And the third part you already mentioned, Matt, is that, of course, you also see that the number of companies are actually benefiting. There was a measure during the World War where there was also a term for it. Those benefiting from the war were asked to pay a windfall tax or a sort of recovery tax for companies that disproportionately benefit from the enormous damage to the economy because of the pandemic. So you could think of some of the huge retailers, but especially I think the big tech firms are having quite a field day. And you know, as per usual, they're offering to develop apps, and their owners are, you know, spreading around charity money. But I think it's time for them to pay their part, and it should be part of a bigger recovery project, kickstarting the economy again and making sure that there's fairness in who's paying for what.
Thanks for that, Lodewijk. You know that I agree with you that, you know, we need a fairer system. I'd like to turn, if I can, a little bit to talk about those people who are helping us through the crisis and what may emerge as one of the political cleavages coming out of this. You know, you mentioned that the government is now paying 90% of salaries for large numbers of workers to stay at home. Yet on the front line, you know, we have health workers, delivery people, shop workers, others who are working longer hours, putting themselves at risk to do that. It seems to me that, you know, like as we emerge out of this crisis, there has to be a rebalancing in terms of those workers to tackle the inequality. And I wonder if you could just talk about the politics of that, how you see progressives being able to build a narrative on that, whether there's a renewed sense of social cohesion in our societies that you think will allow us to make that shift, to pay, you know, not only to demand that those people in the private sector on the front line get a fairer deal, but also those of us who are those working in health services and other care industries.
Yes, I think there's a feeling of cynicism or sometimes even betrayal amongst those working in healthcare when they see the clapping happening, as happens in many countries. And on one hand, it's a very sweet way of showing our appreciation. But on the other hand, they're just saying, well, we don't want to be heroes or called heroes. We want to be able to do our work in a safe manner, even though personal protection equipment has been very scarce. And we just want to be paid in a decent way for the work we're doing. And I think there's a message in their response for all of us, especially for progressive politics and progressives around the globe. And I think, you know, we've been on the defense on the debate on what real jobs are and what government should pay for when it comes to public workers and workers in the vital sectors for too long. So our response should be to actually stop clapping and start organizing for a more profound and more structural change. Not a one-term payout, but, you know, a re-evaluation of what's really important and what provides quality. And in my country, I think there's two things that need to be addressed immediately. We have the most flexible workforce in Europe, and most of the people working on the front line are in precarious contracts. So that should change, because that enables people to also organize and raise their voice. And second, it's just about wages. We need to raise minimum wages. You see that the economic consensus is changing. The orthodoxy was that a higher minimum wage is, of course, killing jobs, but this has been proven wrong in many studies, and you see that many states in the United States have raised their minimum wage. But this is also a way of making sure that people working in the distribution centers actually deserve a decent income. And that also helps, I think, to touch a more sensitive issue in breaking the chain of continuous underpayment of labor migrants who are doing some of those more precarious jobs. I think that's just a result of society not paying decent wages and secure contracts instead of, so they're not causing the problem, but they're victims of a system that is, I think, exploratory and not fair. It means that I think also elections need to be fought on this issue. We will have a general election next year, and I think the United States seem to have an election sometime soon. So this has to be on the election agenda. We need to campaign on this because it's actually a clear choice voters will have to make. Will we go back to the old normal, which will be a more unequal, unfair normal? Or will we try to build something new, which actually appreciates what we see happening right now?
Thanks, Lodewijk. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a problem with my mute button there. Look, I think as we move towards a new normal, not back to the old normal, something that's a little bit more progressive, if you will, I wonder whether it's not time for us all to also to think about how we measure the our economic health. So, for as you said, your country has been obsessed with deficits, even though borrowing is low. So there's a need to move away from that. But I also wonder, Jacinda Ardern, who has actually handled, I think, the crisis in New Zealand about as anyone else in the developed world. Last year she introduced the first well-being budget, and looking at a broader set of issues, including equality, mental health, a broader investment in public services and so on, as a means of assessing the real economic health of the nation. I wonder if you think that's something that progressives everywhere should be pursuing, whether we should be looking for a different standard of measurement about how our economy is doing and how it's serving society and the communities.
Well, first of all, let me address a discussion. You're not saying or stating this, but you can read about people who are saying, well, we need actually degrowth, or we need to shrink our economies. I'm not part of that team, so to say. I think we do need growth. We do need jobs to prosper and build a fair welfare society. But then again, there's big differences, and I think Jacinda Ardern has been an example in leadership for all of us, not only in the choices she made, but also in the way she communicated them to the people of New Zealand. We've seen how she responded to the Christchurch attacks, but during this pandemic, I especially like when she said, well, the fairy tooth is also part of a vital profession. So, you don't have to worry about these kids, and addressing kids directly, smiling, and I think that there's a lot to learn for all of us from what she's done. That also goes for this well-being budget. So I think first you need to make sure that we do need growth. We do need our economies to grow, but there's choices to be made. And it's always been presented to us as a TINA. There is no alternative. Growth means pollution. Growth means insecurity for workers. Growth means low pay for you and high rewards for the stock owners. Growth means your well-being might suffer for our GDP growth, and that's a discourse that has to change. And I think what Jacinda has done is not the only way to do that, but it's a very inspiring way to show people that the things we appreciate when we're laying awake at night are not necessarily the same things that we're appreciating when we read our neoliberal macroeconomic reports. When you lay awake at night, you worry about the jobs for your kids, whether they will be able to find affordable housing, whether there will be healthcare when you're old, whether the planet will still be there. So they are actually worth so much more to both you and me and all people tuning in, that has to have a place and it has to be balanced. And I think part of it is that we are educated in measuring some costs, and other costs are just, for society. Pollution is I think, an important example of that. And once you take it into account, I think you get a fairer image of what helps both your economy and your well-being. And I think if we as progressives form governments that put the well-being of our citizens at the front, that could not only help us win elections, but it could more importantly help us and our citizens to find their place in the modern world without the feeling that there's always a trade-off and you're always on the wrong end.
Thanks, and thanks also for clarifying. You're correct. I wasn't suggesting that we don't need growth at all, as you rightly point out, suggesting that we might need to look at a variety of different indicators to look at our economic health. But on this sort of dilemma and these tough choices we have to make, I wonder how you feel about sustainable development or the climate and its place within the recovery. There are a number of people who are sort of talking about this pandemic as the revenge of the planet in some way, that it's because of the way we have interacted as human beings, our economy and society with Mother Nature, that we're in this situation. And there are those who say that because we're not flying as much, because we're not consuming as much, because we're not traveling as much, that the climate has benefited. And that may lead some to say that there's a trade-off between moving on from this pandemic and also defeating it and saving the climate and recovering and getting growth back again. I mean, do you see that as a trade-off, or do you see a way in which actually the sustainable development agenda, the green agenda, can actually be one of the key drivers of the recovery?
Yeah, well, I look at COVID-19 as a horrible disease, I know people who lost their relatives to it, so I have some trouble looking at it as our own doing, or Mother Nature taking revenge, and look, now the dolphins are swimming in the Amstel. I just think it's a horrible disease and we have to deal with it, and there's nothing fun about it. But that doesn't mean that we cannot learn from what we're seeing. And one of the things we see that I do like is very clean air, and that saves lives. Another thing that I see that I do like is that we are able as a society to improvise and to change when needed, and to change really fast. And I think those aspects, the quality of life by breathing clean air, and our ability, which is much bigger than one would have thought of, to adapt and to change, are things we need to take into the equation when we're dealing with the climate crisis, because that's another crisis that's creeping up on us. So I think it is important to use the momentum and the enormous investment that's needed for economic recovery to make the necessary changes and make sure that we help companies to change, that we help them to pollute less and diminish their carbon footprint. So yes, I think it should be a green recovery, not as a semi-religious guilt inspired way to repay Mother Earth, but as a modern progressive way to address this crisis, which is in itself threatening us, being it in a different level in different parts of the world. And what's hopeful is that I think it also shows that we can, if we make that choice, if we help companies, but also if we tax them, if we introduce a carbon tax to make sure that it's actually economically viable to change the way you produce, then we could use this as an opportunity in itself, without Instagramming that this is just a wonderful occasion, because I think in general it's not.
No, I agree with those sentiments wholeheartedly. I wonder if I could move on to the element of international solidarity in this era. It's certainly clear that much of the developing world will be hit by this awful pandemic, and may well likely be harder hit and unable to get some of the resources that they need to recover as quickly as the more developed nations. So, you know, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And then a related issue, but more political. You know, we have seen the rise of populism across many of the Western European and indeed Eastern European countries, and a call to sort of close up our borders. I suspect that, you know, they will be invigorated, many of the populists, by what they're witnessing at the moment, and try and push that agenda further. So I'm wondering what you think international solidarity looks like in a post-COVID-19 world.
Well, I think it's a very important question, and we have to answer it at least 3 different levels. I think you mentioned the developing world. You need to realize that there's no real security from the virus if it's not under control anywhere in the world. So that's why it's a pandemic. So the idea that we can just, you know, protect ourselves and have the rest of the world, you know, sweat it out, I think that would be naive, and it would be not morally acceptable. So it's crucial that we help developing countries, also because of some of the responses to COVID-19 are, you know, hurting them in a different way. A lockdown in countries without social security is just making sure that people are starving, and you can see this happening at some places in the world. So I think there should also be a global aid conference on how we are going to help developing countries not only deal with the health crisis, but also with economic recovery. The second level of international solidarity is within the developed world, between the countries of the developed world. The cooperation between the United States and Europe has to improve if we want to, you know, unilateral extreme measures are both hurting economies and not helping us in the fight against COVID-19. But also within the European Union, you see, of course, a lot of distrust, and those are sensitive issues, because solidarity translates, especially, you know, in the hands of populists, in paying for someone else, and a lot of stereotyping goes on, and this has led to Brexit in a way. This discourse of tabloids, you know, telling the Brits for decades that they were actually paying for the others, and that the others were benefiting. So we have to be extremely careful about this. But I strongly believe that you need solidarity now in terms of how you're going to pay for recovery, but also in actually working together on a very pragmatic and practical level in trying to help companies, trying to make sure that we find the best strategy to control the disease in this period of time. Populists right now, but it depends. You see an enormous rally around the flag effect all over the world. And it can be rallying around the populist flag, but also about conservative or liberal or social democratic flag. This will, you know, this will ease away, I think, when the current crisis, the immediate crisis, is over. And then it's important that we present a clear agenda for our future. Because if we do not present a progressive vision, a roadmap for where we're going to go, how we want to emerge from this crisis, then it's a populist who's saying, well, I have the solution. Close all borders, blame China, etc., etc. But I'm quite optimistic because it also, I think the crisis also shows the need for competence, the need for, you know, using scientific advice, the need for open discussions on what's the best approach. I think populists have also been caught out by, you know, you just cannot fake newsing this crisis away. So we have to step up and not talk so much about the populists, but more about our alternative, our choices, present them, But then I'm quite positive that we can emerge not only from the COVID crisis, but also emerge from the populist threat.
Thanks, Lodewijk. I'd like to transition, if I can, now to some questions about democracy and some of the democratic dilemmas that we may face. It seems clear, obviously, that we're going to, we talked here about the big tech companies, and it seems clear that in some ways we may well end up being slightly dependent on some of their technologies as we ease social distancing measures, as we try and open up and return people to work safely. I wonder what you think about how we can ensure that we respect and protect people's privacy during a period where we may well be tracking and tracing who they've met and who they've come into contact, and what sort of framework or digital rights framework we might be able to build around that to ensure that it only lasts for as long as necessary and doesn't become a kind of permanent feature of our society.
I think you're very right that this is a true dilemma, because I think we all long for reopening and making sure that the restaurants open again and that we can enjoy the good weather. But right now we do not have the right protection in place. I think if we look at technological solutions, we have to first say that they can only be part of the approach. They can never replace old-fashioned tracking and tracing, which is done by human beings. I think some countries, Canada, but also Germany, are applying that lesson quite well. So they're hiring students, volunteers, and people to help tracking and tracing, because that's what we need to do. You want to eliminate the virus, and once it pops up, you need to have an organization in place, but also just the human beings in place to make phone calls and visit, and then isolate and quarantine. But of course, technical solutions could be helpful. But here, big tech has a reputation of overpromise and underdeliver, because I think so far we've also seen some very I don't know how to say it politely, but it sometimes just is not true. But they could be very helpful, and we need them on the longer term. I think there's a number of demands have to be made by society, also from a democratic point of view. First of all, it has to be open source software. We cannot, allow this to be part of a trade secret. Second, it has to be temporary. Third, it has to be voluntary. You don't want people to force people to bring a mobile phone and put on an app to be able to do this. Four, you don't want this to be in the hands of a private company, because there's data involved. So that has to be in public hand. And five, you don't want it to be traced to individuals. They need to be able to be warned, but you don't want a central database with the whereabouts of millions of people at a certain point of time, because that technology could be very dangerous. Tech firms have told me that within those 5 demands, they will be able to develop something that could be helpful. And that I would welcome. I would applaud that. But I think we need to protect basic human rights in our democracy in making those demands, from before starting to adopt those apps on a large scale.
Thanks, Lodewijk. I mean, in some ways, that's saying that we use this technology to give people information that they might have been exposed to the virus rather than to track them. So it falls on a sort of certain degree of individual and personal responsibility to follow up, which I think most people have in some ways exhibited during this crisis. I'd like to also just raise a question about what kind of democratic or institutional reform might be required in Europe. You spoke about the need to harmonize corporate tax levels in Europe, for example, something that's been a taboo for a long while. You have also been very forthright in your view that we need some form of more advanced common European debt strategy to help the southern countries, but everybody recover from this, the financial and budgetary pressures of this crisis. But of course, that's very tricky to achieve in the current European framework. So I'm wondering whether you think there might be a case for advocating for some democratic or institutional reform at the European level, or modernization that would allow and facilitate the development of a common European strategy.
Yeah, maybe first to add on your last question, I don't want to sound too negative about the technological innovation that we also see, because there's something wonderful in that. You see an enormous development. I think there's 8,000 peer-reviewed articles on COVID-19 already. And also on the technological scale, there's a lot of innovation. There's an Amsterdam hospital that has provided people with an app that can help them self-diagnose and therefore track the development of the disease. So there's a lot of positives to be said about that technological aspect of the crisis. So you have to be careful and stake your demands, but you also have to embrace the fact that we use all our knowledge and all our skills and our innovation to deal with this crisis. Then to come to your next question, I think on the institutional level, we need to allow ourselves to reevaluate the way the European Union is organized. Two examples: when it comes to competition law, that's been in place as one of the pillars, rock solid, of the European Union. But it also has come to mean something that quite often protected big corporate interests and hampered hospitals from working together, or hampered self-employed to organize, because that's the direct translation from aspects of competition law. Now we're in a period where there's massive state aid for corporations, where we see that in order to tackle this crisis, hospitals have to work together. They're not competing, they have to work together. So that should lead to a reevaluation of that part of European law. The same goes, I think, for competence questions. I think we've seen now that if we want to be able to recover from this, there has to be a way to pay for it. Countries cannot pay for it by themselves. So there has to be a way to raise money. And there's just a limited amount of ways to do this. It could be by taxation. So you could have European taxation, for example, on big tech, which would cause a certain amount of income, which could be used to borrow money to pay for recovery. Or as a number of countries, you can decide to work together and for a defined and limited period of time and amount of money, you can combine, mutualize your debts on this issue. Very tabooish subject, but not so strange if you look at how, for example, the United States responds to crises like this. But I would think that this should lead to an open debate on how Europe can be enabled to respond on a more swift and direct manner to this crisis. And I'm glad that the European Union countries, member states have agreed on this first package, which consists out of 3 approaches and combining for almost 500 billion euros. But I think nobody would discuss the fact that we actually need double that amount. And I think taboos will not help us here. So yes, that should lead to an institutional realignment. It should think of rethinking on what issues Europe should be competent. I would think that Europe could be a bit more relaxed on, for example, how countries will deal with labor migration. You can have them make their own arrangements to make sure that this is not hurting labor markets, but actually that it's free movement of people instead of just a free lunch for the big corporations. But yes, this needs to be discussed, and it's a difficult discussion. Everybody knows it, but I think it's about time.
Thanks, Lodewijk. I mean, I certainly think if there'd have been a bit more discretion on the freedom of movement of workers, we may have be in a situation where the United Kingdom was still a member of the European Union. Unfortunately, no longer is, to my great regret. I'm going to move the final two questions, but I'd just like to say, Sherry Trojman, sorry if I've butchered your name, has on the chat facility, you may not have seen, has been talking about the need for a genuine progress indicator, which I think is a very good way for progressives to think about the branding or talking about the well-being budget. And so maybe that's something that we can all explore as we move forward. But you've already addressed that question. But there's also a lot of talk about a lot of interest in your view around universal basic income. Do you see this as a way of helping us out of the crisis? I mean, in many ways, you could say the vast majority of our workers now are on a kind of 90% salary UBI type system. As we begin to sort of ease that out, is universal basic income a way in which we can facilitate that transition, or should we be looking at other measures?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think, personally, I've never been a supporter of universal basic income. But this crisis also forces me to rethink that position. I always thought that people are better off with universal basic jobs, that by a right to work and basic income that you can come home from saying I earned this money. But sometimes it becomes a semantic discussion when it's jobs created by the government. So I'm still not convinced that it could be the long-term solution, because most of the studies I read about it is, the difficulty is, of course, that it's always too high and therefore killing a lot of jobs, or too low and therefore causing a lot of inequality. Whilst if you have full employment as your policy objective, and you're willing to create jobs and create opportunity, that could lead to a better outcome for people that are dependent on it and that do not find work in the current regular labor market. But I'm open for discussion, open for arguments. I think we all should be willing to take a new look at our points of view, and the same goes for universal basic income. But for now, I believe that we should try and change this situation in new jobs, creating jobs that are part of a more sustainable future, and also creating jobs that are part of our public services, instead of trying to solve it with a long-term universal basic income. But this is of course a subject that is discussed in our progressive family with great passion nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm going to turn to the final question, and we've covered a lot so far: social contract, internationalism, the politics of the European Union, universal basic income, new measures of well-being. But Gavin Charles has asked, what do you think the most overlooked issue is when we talk about recovery? Something that we should address, that is fundamental to the process, but that generally seems to get neglected.
Well, I think maybe 2 points that seem to almost go unnoticed. First of all, the fact that transportation was so overvalued. Of course, I've read some people making that point, but there's something there that we could use to our benefit. And it's not the biggest issue, but I think it could be useful in how we're going to invest our public money. When we have to decide, are we going to build roads or are we going to build schools? The second thing that is much of an issue in the United States, but not so much in my country, in the Netherlands. And I've read about it in the UK, but I don't know if it's looked at enough in all of our countries. Is how this virus is affecting people in a different way. The fact that minorities are hurt so much more in the United States and I believe in the UK, it's largely neglected in the Netherlands and in some other countries in Europe. And I think we have to look at this and be honest about it, and realize that once again, ignoring the health differences that we see that are part of our larger economic inequality is something we need to address as a society. It's not just a fact of life, it's the outcome of political choices. And so I would hope that some of you who I cannot see but who are turning in will start writing about this and organizing about this and campaigning about this, because it's really unfair to people who are much more vulnerable about this. And if we are not careful about this, it will lead to another, I would say, neoliberal, guilt-inspired response, telling people, well, hey, you're overweight. That's your own fault. Well, I think it's more of the outcome of the fact that we've, let our food industry, have people become addicted to cheap food that makes them unhealthy. It's just an example of another social aspect of what we're witnessing now that I think should not be overlooked. But it's a great question, and maybe you have suggestions yourself that you can put into the chat that we should look into.
Thanks very much, Gavin, for that question, and thanks, Lodewijk, for answering. We're going to close the conversation there, but as I said, this is only the start of an ongoing conversation. For those of you who joined us today and participated in this, thanks very much. Thanks for your engagement, and thanks for your questions. Sorry if I didn't manage to get to all of them, but in future sessions, we will try and address them. You can rewatch this podcast, this webinar, on the recoveryproject.org. You can also find all of our podcasts there. And for those of you who are interested in the debate at Canada, a reminder that the Canada team will be online at 2 o'clock local time to talk about where to start the restart. But for now, I'll close by thanking Lodewijk Asscher for sharing his vision about how we rebuild after the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you for your time. Best of luck in getting traction for those ideas in the Netherlands, and look forward to seeing you again soon, my friend. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks everybody for joining, and thanks the Recovery Project for organizing this webinar. Be safe, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Over and out.